I'm going to give our last presentation in this session. And one thing I kind of point out, you know, you got a bit of alphabet soup here. It's kind of, SHRP2 is a lot of alphabet soup, a lot of letters and numbers that go with all these projects. And so Steve was talking about a number of L projects, but one C project stuck in this and snuck in there. And then Kathy was talking about an L project, and I'm going to talk about an R project. So just to explain that briefly, basically the areas that Steve showed on his one slide, the 4 focus areas for the SHRP2 research. So there's the safety area, capacity, renewal, and reliability. Well, you might notice there's 2 R's in there, renewal and reliability. So renewal got the R, and for all projects under the renewal area, they had an R designation, and so reliability had to have another letter. So reliability has the L designation, and so the reliability projects, which is mostly what we've been talking about so far in terms of development, were done under the reliability area and with the L designation. So why do we include a C project? Why are we including an R project? Well, as Steve showed on his diagram, a number of all these other areas do have some effect on reliability when we go to look at reliability, and they do impact it. And so there's a tie-in with a number of the capacity products and a number of the renewal products when it comes to analyzing for reliability, when it comes to operating the system and improving reliability. So the tool Steve mentioned has some aspects that the C11 project that fit in with analyzing for reliability, and so does this one. So this one, R11, is a Workzone Impact and Strategy Estimator tool. And the name across the top there, the WISE tool, is a key product that came out of this project. And it's even though it's under the renewal area, like I mentioned, it has an impact on reliability, and it was going to actually fall under the reliability area when it comes to implementation. So even though it was developed under the other area, so it's definitely one that we're putting some effort into under the reliability area at Federal Highway. So essentially, what is it? It's a tool to help agencies coordinate road projects. You know, projects get on the plan a while back, and there could be any number of projects on there. And how do we know which projects to do in what order, which projects maybe we can do at the same time, and which ones we should intentionally avoid doing at the same time if we want to have good operations on our system, if we don't want to put too much stress on a particular area of our transportation network. Well, there's a need to look at that, and often what happens is instead of looking at that up front, when these projects are getting programmed and when they're getting sequenced, often what happens is they're on there, we're moving forward, we're looking for when the funding's available, and you know, they may have certain different priorities tied to them, but then we actually start really looking at how they impact the network right now when it comes to detailed project planning. When we're down the line, and we're often looking at it on a project-by-project basis, and some consideration of nearby projects or other concurrent projects, but we're often not looking at it as a whole program of projects and what makes sense if we look at the whole program. So this tool is intended to help do that, to identify kind of an optimal sequencing basically, and to assess, well, if I use different kinds of strategies, how does that likely to affect the cost of the project and the overall sense of how much it taxes the transportation system, to help us decide which strategies might be the most useful. So this tool is intended to be used during the planning and programming stage of the project development process, but it can be, as projects, more details become available, it can be used again during design to kind of refine that, so that it's kind of can be used in both places. In terms of the modeling spectrum or the tool spectrum, it kind of falls in the mesoscopic area, kind of between the macro and micro type of tools. So it's kind of between the travel demand modeling on the macro level and the detailed simulation modeling on the micro level. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about the tool as you go forward. So it actually comes out of a project that's overall titled Strategic Approaches at the Corridor and Network Levels to Minimize Disruptions from the Renewal Process. You know, renewal process, of course, being rehabilitation, total reconstruction, expansion on various facilities. So the tool is a key piece that came out of that. And why did the tool get developed? Well, there was an idea to assess the need for a tool kind of going into the project, but it was borne out by the research findings in the first part of the project. So there were widely varying levels when looking at the state of the practice in terms of trying to sequence projects, trying to understand what was a good way to sequence that when a number of projects need to be done in a given area. And kind of what came out of that too is there were a couple of different kinds of, there's a whole long list of strategies you could use on any road project to help manage the impacts. You've got contracting, you've got accelerating construction, you've got using some prefabricated type of materials to do that. You've got law enforcement, for example, to manage certain kinds of impacts. You've got speed management, things like that. So you've got a whole range of types of strategies, and that it would be best to group them kind of into two areas based on feedback from some panels that were convened for this. So demand-based strategies, how do we reduce demand in the area? And then duration-based strategies, how do we reduce the time it takes to do the work? And again, those encompass a large number of strategies within that. And then another piece that came out of there was, yes, there was a need to have some kind of software tool to help us do this. We've got some tools that we can use in the work zones to analyze a particular project, but it's a little tougher to kind of look at this a little bit, broader level. But one thing that did come up is that it would be really helpful if the tools were compatible with existing systems or data, or can we use some of what we're already doing when we go to implement the tools. Okay, so what is the kind of intended target audience for this? It was thought to be kind of a little bit of a range, but basically program managers and planners, both in the urbanized states, particularly in urban areas where you're more likely to have conflicts when you have a number of projects going on, and then when you're in let's say in a large MPO. Of course, it goes without saying you need to have an active renewal program. You need to have enough projects going on that you would want to actually use the tool to analyze that. So then the next phase of the project was to go ahead and develop the software tool and a user guide for that, and that's where the WISE tool comes in. And then there was some field validation done at 2 sites to try out the tool and to see if it gave reasonable results looking at historical data, and then to do some pilot testing looking at kind of forward-looking data. And I'll go into some of these steps a little bit more detail here. But to take a step back, first of all, well, why do we need this tool? I kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. I guess one key thing is the transportation systems and network. What we're doing in one place may have no effect at all over here, or it may have a significant effect on another area of the network. It does depend. And if we're having a lot of projects go on at a particular time, we may take out every option. I've had that personal experience on my route to work, which is, about 12 miles. I can go through a work zone on this route or this route or this route, and I don't really necessarily sometimes have a choice of another way to go that doesn't lead me through road work. And if it's managed well, that may be okay. If it's not managed well, that may be a 9-month, lots of wasted time. So what we do in one part of the network does have an effect. And if we have a number of work zones on one particular route, that can really multiply the effects. Another one, current conditions. We were hearing in the sessions this morning, growing urbanization. I think has been a trend across the country. So we often have a lot more people and a lot more stuff going on, sometimes in very concentrated areas. So these conflicts can come up more often. And a lot more of our work needs to be done repairing roads and bridges in at least a good portions of our country. So that means traffic's going to be affected. And then on top of that, you don't just have the road work going on in the right-of-way, but you've got a lot of things like utility work. And you've got not just the state, you've got the county, you may have the city, sometimes all doing work in a particular area. So trying to coordinate that can really be helpful. And if we don't, we can end up with a lot of projects close together. You can end up with street cuts on recently paved roads. We've probably all seen that on occasion. You think, gosh, they just worked on this a couple of months ago, and now here they are, and it's dug up again. And then, that affects the quality and also causes more impacts to road users. So conversely, these are some of the benefits that you could see on the other side. Sometimes cost savings. If we coordinate, we can identify impacts sooner and hopefully reduce them overall. Hopefully end up with better quality if we don't keep making those street cuts in the same area. And ultimately, I think it can be a win-win for various agencies if you can get the coordination to happen. I put a graphic that New York City has used before. They have I'll share in a minute on their effort for coordination, but it basically, these are some of the benefits they've seen on their program to coordinate and reduce street cuts. So kind of this tool is looking at what's going on in the state of the practice and how can we coordinate. You can do it at different scopes. You can do it in a more confined area in a city. You can do it in a corridor. You can do it in a region. You could do it even statewide to some degree. Not so much, not necessarily would you want to use this tool for a statewide, but you might do it at a higher level for a statewide. You can use different methods. So just to briefly show you why this tool, where this tool fits in. A couple examples of current practices. You've got coordination meetings. Just convene a group of people the year before, looking at next year's projects or next 2 years of projects. What do you have on your agenda? What do you have on your plan? And talk about that and identify conflicts, basically, and how we might want to work. There's a couple of regional groups that do that I mentioned up there on the slide, Transcom in the Northeast and the Great Lakes area. A couple of areas have tried kind of corridor or regional transportation management plans. They have a project-specific one, which is required for federal aid projects, but then they also have done a corridor or regional one when they have a number of projects going on in the area. In Oregon, it was the case of freight. They were really affecting freight through a major bridge program, and they knew they were going to have a lot of work zones in one stretch. Or in the case of Northern Virginia, there were just a number of large projects going on in a very high traffic area. So they decided to coordinate. So that's another approach. This is another example. I mentioned New York City there. They do an online mapping, and a couple other places like Baltimore have also tried using software for online mapping, and they get different entities to input their data, their projects into there. They come up with an agreement like an MOU or something to input the information. And then, they've got the usual things like permits and inspections that generally happen everywhere. But they also put a repair schedule online, and then it gets recorded on this map so they can identify where there might be conflicts coming up. A couple of things that I'll mention, that they have a protected street area. So if it's been repaved basically in the last 5 years, if you want to do work there, you pay a higher permit fee, and you're held to a higher standard for how you restore the road. Has to be in better condition than if it was not repaved in the last 5 years. So that's kind of an incentive to try and use this tool and pay attention to when upcoming projects are, to see maybe if a utility needs to do some work there and it's planned work, can they do it before the street's going to be repaved and not afterward? So a couple of those kind of tactics or tools to use. Corridor performance measures. This example there on the upper right about looking at delay across a whole corridor. They recognize if you're going this is basically from the Canada edge of Michigan across I-94 all the way across the state to the Indiana line. They recognize even though they have a maximum 10-minute delay per project, in here, I think it's, about 14 projects they list across the state in there. If they each have 10 minutes of delay, you've just delayed that commercial vehicle over 2 hours. Driving across. If every project meets the performance metric they have, which is pretty tight, 10 minutes of delay for some projects, that'd be pretty tight, but you still get over 2 hours of delay in that one season with these projects that would be going on there. So that's another type of tool. But then when it comes down, and then modeling, it's been kind of more limited though. Special cases, we got this big situation coming up. We got these 2 projects that'll be nearby. Let's look at 2 projects and how they might affect each other. But in reality, we didn't have a way of looking at a program of projects, looking further ahead before a bunch of decisions have already been made. And things have been kind of getting locked in a little bit more, and it's a little harder to make some of these changes. So the WISE tool, that's where it comes in, is helping trying to plan further ahead and maybe looking at a little more complex set of projects. So to get into the tool a little bit, there's a planning module and an operations module. And basically, data requirements, kind of minimum data requirements going in are to put in a network. It generally uses a dynasty format, but you can import a network or you can create a network. They definitely recommend importing a network rather than trying to create one fully in the tool. And then some data sets, some information on the traffic, the projects that you have in your program, and any strategies that you think you might want to use. And in theory can be applied to any size network or corridor and an unlimited number of projects. Of course, the more you have, the longer it's going to take to run, and so there's some practical bounds to how much you would want to use in there. There's a graphical user interface in there to help guide the user along and support some of the inputs to that. It uses non-proprietary software in general. So the user interface, these are just, a couple of aspects of it, kind of how you put the data in. Some of it's numerical, some of it's typing in text, some of it's radio buttons, that type of thing. There is an ability, like I said, to do some edits to a network in there if you import a network into there. Typical things like validation checks that are part of any good tool. And then, so initially when you go in there, you get a welcome screen, you enter a workspace. And a workspace is essentially a folder for your scenario, your whole program of projects. It's where everything you input is going to be held in that one folder. That's really what a workspace is. Then you can import or create a network or modify one you already have in there, input traffic data to the system. This is an example. It's maybe a little bit hard to see on the screen there, but this is a network that was used for some of the tool development. That's actually Guam, if it doesn't look particularly familiar, but that was used for the development and initial testing of the tool. These are some of the types of data that go in for the planning module. So some of the basic stuff like, seasonal factors to vary your demand, by month, for example. Start and end of your renewal program. Or you want to look at a 8 or 9 month construction season? Do you want to look at 2 years or full year? Kind of what's the length of overall the program of projects you're going to look at? And then you can analyze for, that whole time, or you can analyze for a subset of that time as you look at it. A value for road user cost. What are you valuing people's time at? You'd enter that into the tool. You can enter descriptions for projects if you want. And then what they did, instead of entering a set list of strategies that for those two categories I mentioned earlier, the demand-based and duration-based, they realized in reality there's almost an infinite set of strategies, not totally, but it's quite a long list. And there may be other ones that come up over time that would kind of limit the tool. So instead of putting them in there, you basically have the ability to build your own strategy library. And essentially it's a name, and for example, how much do we think will divert traffic by this particular strategy? Divert or reduce traffic, maybe reduce demand. You put just a little bit in there. You can see on there trip reductions, how wide of a radius is that likely to affect, and cost for that strategy. So it's not a lengthy amount of information for each strategy. This is the type of project-specific info. That past stuff kind of applies to the whole program of projects. This would be the project-specific info. A lot of that's pretty, I think, self-explanatory. A couple I'll comment on, though. Project precedence. Does this project need to finish before this one can start? You may have that a little bit. You can say, like, if I've got 9 projects in there, Project 7 has to finish before Project 9 can happen. Or Project 3 needs to finish before Project 6 can happen, and you can put that kind of information in there so that it puts constraints on the solutions that can come out. And then the project link is essentially where is the project going to happen in the network. So that's essentially what goes in there. Diversion percentage, you can see on the bottom, as well as the strategies, is actually optional information because the user can enter a diversion percentage, or the WISE program can estimate it based as it goes through its algorithm. It does use static traffic assignment during the planning module. It's not a dynamic traffic assignment model. So essentially, you're running the model, and for the output, you get a list of projects. There's a little bit of a sample of a piece of that list there in the screenshot. So that would give you the projects in chronological order. Of course, you can always change parameters and run it again and see how it affects the outcome. For it. It does use kind of a taboo method to try and eliminate, reduce the number of options that it needs to analyze. So the runtime, the computational time, of course, varies on the network and your computer system capabilities. Just to give you an example, the test case using the Guam network, using 6 projects, when they ran it for the test case, the developers, it took 12 minutes to run. So that was kind of the runtime area. The actually part that seemed to take the most time is actually making sure the network is input right, which I think is, is true about a number of tools. Here's another example of output. You've got a list of projects. These are just project numbers on the left, and then kind of putting them out on a timeline. The operations, the planning module is really the core of the model. The operations module, what it really does is uses the data from the planning module, but it allows you to use Dynasty for dynamic traffic assignment. So you could get a more, really a more robust traffic assignment if you use the operations module. So you could, basically in the operations module, it runs the base scenario to kind of reestablish that with dynamic traffic assignment rather than static one that came from the planning module. And then you do the project scenario, which runs it for each project. What's the project likely to do with traffic assignment? And then you can use those dynamically generated traffic assignment values to rerun the planning module to provide more refined analysis. So sometimes some of that information isn't available as much to run a good dynamic traffic assignment until you get a little bit more information about the project, so you could use it a little bit further along sometimes to enable that analysis. So to move to the last part, so they did some testing and evaluation. There were 2 sites that were done for the initial testing and validation. That was in Des Moines, Iowa, and Phoenix area. So this used historical data. They basically said, do you have a good set of kind of good records on how you sequence these projects and what happens, so that we can run the model with them and see what it recommends and how that compares to what you actually did and how it went for you. So that was essentially what happened during these. So they were largely looking for sites that had that kind of information, that had a readily available travel demand network, so that would bound the amount of time that went into getting that together. And like I say, they had an understanding of the outcomes of their program and how it had gone. They had paid attention to that and maybe had some after action kind of information on that. So there was a series of projects on I-235 in Des Moines, and then a series of projects on 2 different roadways in Phoenix that were used. For the pilot tests, those were also done at 2 sites, 2 other areas, and that was using kind of forward-looking data. What is our upcoming projects on our program that we'd like to look at? So that was in Orlando and in Worcester, Massachusetts, and trying to say, these are in the planning phase now. Here's the recommendations we get. Do these seem realistic to you? To get their kind of take on, as a tool, providing you what seems helpful for your planning. So to give you some idea of some of the results of the testing, and this is pretty recent that the testing has been wrapping up. It's actually still the analysis report for that just got developed a few weeks ago. And so some of the successes, it did work to generate the kind of output you're hoping to get, to have a optimized time frame for a program of work projects, and it seemed reasonable. The results seemed reasonable. That it did calculate user costs. Those are based on delay and diversion, and then those get added to construction cost. You put the construction cost in there earlier in the data I showed, and that gives you an overall total cost for that sequence of projects and how it's set up. It did a reasonable job of discerning between different mitigation strategies. By that I mean it gave different results for different kind of strategies, so you didn't get exactly the same. It seemed to be sensitive enough to that. There were some changes made after the first validation site that was done. A couple of those were just how the user cost and construction costs were reported. They weren't kept on the scheduling report, and then it was too hard. It was difficult to go back and say, well, then if I change the user cost to a certain amount, or if I change certain variables, how does that affect the user cost? Because that wasn't there. So that's more of a reporting thing. One of the other things, though, was how user cost was calculated was not being calculated in the same kind of time frame as the construction cost. It wasn't matching up real well, and it was giving some odd results, so they went ahead and fixed that. Those were some kind of maybe somewhat simple or more straightforward changes. But a couple of considerations for improvement from these results from these efforts. One is the underlying network platform that's used to be able to modify a network, or if you're going to be building a network, has some limitations. The initial coding time takes a little too long, and there are certain features, like certain things like ramps and others that are hard. You basically don't have the capability to code real well. It's a little bit limited. Part of that was they built it based on Guam, and Guam doesn't have certain kind of roadway features that it doesn't encompass everything you would see, apparently. So that is a limitation that somewhat you can work with, but it would be better if it didn't have to kind of work with that. It would just account for all that. So basically, it would allow use of formats that users already use, and situate a little bit broader on some of those types of situations you'd encounter. After a project is completed, the capacity doesn't reset to 100%. That's maybe not as difficult to handle in terms of making a modification, but essentially, if you've got a set of 14 projects, well, when project 2 and 3 are done, they no longer have capacity restrictions on them and they're done. They may have even had an expansion and have increased capacity beyond 100%. If you don't change that at that point in the sequence, you've got less. You're not dealing with all the model isn't factoring in all the capacity you really have available to you. So that's something that they realized was a limitation they need to be addressed. And then just a little bit more robustness in the planning module and some of the flexibility for the locations. So some of what the next steps are basically at this point in time. The final report is being worked on now. It should be done around the end of the month when the project wraps up on the TRB side of the SHRP2 efforts. So at that point, we're going to be basically doing more. I just gave you a little overview of kind of where the tool is at in terms of some of the findings from the pilots, but we'll be doing a more assessment, working with AASHTO, talking to TRB, getting their input as well as the developers. Is it ready for implementation? Do we need to look at, doing some, as Steve mentioned with the other tools, maybe a little bit of refinements or not, depending on where it's at? Or is it better that it's in pretty decent shape and that it might be that a software developer wants to take it the next step? So we'll be looking at, assessing the readiness. And then what should implementation look like? As Kathy mentioned, for the L36 project, there'll be an implementation planning workshop to assess how best to advance the tool. We expect that to be in this summer, mid-2014. And then develop an implementation plan from that. And one thing that we'll be looking at as part of that is there was some kind of a framework for some NHI training developed as part of the tool and the user guide. And so whether that would be useful to carry forward to complete, it's kind of like I say, the guts of the NHI training, but not some of the graphics and other things that would need to go with it and some of the formatting. So whether we want to take that to the next step. So that's an overview of the R11 tool, and open it up for any questions on that or on the earlier products that were presented. Nope. Okay. You go ahead.
Maybe with any luck, I'll spur some discussion. Most of you are on operation shops. How many of you use simulation tools in your organizations? Okay, there's a few hands. If you were to start doing this in your organization and the construction guys walked over to your part of the building and said, I'd like you to do this, what kind of an earthquake would that cause in the organization? Would that be a natural flow or not? I see some shaking heads. So it seems that for various reasons, 10 years ago I worked on the plan for renewal before this program even started. And we thought this was a really significant project because the idea was to reduce user delay, and so you got to do some strategic thinking about how you lay out your work zones. But that requires using some simulation tools, which aren't really all that ubiquitous, and they aren't necessarily used in construction shops. So it seems that there may be some big changes within organizations if we migrate to doing business that way. Now, that's sort of my opinion or my observation. Does that seem like the case, or would this be a no-brainer?
It seems that one of the issues with these predictive tools is you get sometimes predictable results, particularly with some of the early models. I mean, some of them would show huge backups that we didn't think would happen, and they didn't. And then when you find something that works pretty good, you start getting rules of thumb developed. And so then you say, well, do I need to do this on every single model? I mean, I think as the technology gets better, and it looks like we're on our way here, that particularly when you're trying to do a program of projects, it can be real beneficial. But for a lot of individual projects, I think a lot of staff has a good feel for what does a routine project do routinely to traffic, as opposed to, I've got a big nasty project, I need a pretty good detailed analysis on what's going on with traffic. And those are the hard ones that, you know, based on what you put in, it's going to have a huge impact on what you get out of it.
Yeah, you're right. The tools that are on the easier side to use, they don't take so much time that they're too onerous, except to do for the really large projects, sometimes don't give as accurate of results, and it kind of gets to be a little bit fine, the middle of the road. And I think, you know, in the case with this tool, it's you know, intended to kind of give a kind of a big picture, but yeah, I wouldn't say this would be a tool to use for this is how long of a delay we're going to have in this particular project, but relatively speaking, which one is optimal, or which couple or sets of them are similar to help you get there. But I guess one other, you know, kind of comment is, of course, tools like this and any kind of tool don't necessarily consider the political constraints too that go into how projects are programmed and how they're sequenced and all that. So obviously, it's a tool, but it's not going to, you know, solve everything, that's for sure. Other comments or questions?
Well, just a comment about what you just said. Part of the situation we're in with our agency is that we have, in Florida, started going more design build, and that adds another set of circumstances that you're not aware of. But we have a corridor where we decided to break it up, and it wasn't because of logical segments, it's because of the size of the design build contracts that they wanted to have out on the street. So you have to deal with those issues. But I can see where this tool will be beneficial, at least to looking at some of the work zone strategies when you have subsequent projects. Did have a question about your I-4 pilot testing. What was sort of the outcome of some of those results? Just curious, because I am a Florida guy.
Yeah, I actually, to be honest with you, I can't speak to the details because I didn't directly work on that. I can give you there's a copy of a report that came from that if you're interested, or I can follow up with you on, you know, a few of the highlights, but I don't have the specifics. It was more of a overall, these are what came out of the pilot tests. So I unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly on the I-4. I guess I thought we only had a couple minutes left, but I had a few. These are just a few of the website resources on here. But I did want to mention, since these are all projects we're just talking about that are moving toward implementation, but they haven't you know, gotten there yet, unlike the ones in the morning, just to talk a little bit about implementation efforts, kind of what are we looking at going forward with SHRP2. You know, there's a good number of high priority products that will be coming out in the next little while here, not just in the reliability area. That number's for all the renewal and the capacity area and the safety area to some degree. It's a little bit different how that area was done, the safety area. But users, you know, would be across the spectrum in the transportation industry. And the idea is to try and take select products and really integrate them into regular practices, or kind of worded another way. You know, try and get some kind of routine use of SHRP2 products so that years down the road it wasn't a SHRP2 product, it's just how we do something now, and it's helpful to us. So state DOTs, MPOs, resource agencies, you know, maybe other stakeholders might get use or benefit from some of these products. And essentially what we're trying to do with our implementation efforts, the technical assistance, the financial assistance, is to take some of those high priority products and get them to the tipping point. You know, sometimes they're a new way of doing stuff, and I know in my time at Federal Highway, one of the most common questions I get is, what are other states doing? You know, I want to know if somebody else is doing it first, or a few other somebody else's are doing it before I go there. You know, the risk-averse nature in engineering. So these are a couple of the kind of aspects of the, when we go to implement products. Some of it's implementation assistance program, which I'll just say a little bit more on the next slide. Some of it's hearing from the pilots, from the lead adopters, you know, kind of how it worked for them, and sharing that information through like peer exchange or through reports or webinars as well. Different outreach and marketing methods. Some people are going to be champions. They're going to be willing to be provide some leadership on the national level for that. The knowledge transfer system we mentioned as a way of sharing some of this information, helping get these products into the hands of more folks and interest and awareness of them. And then some technical support from Federal Highway as well in these various products. So just to mention, so you're aware of the Implementation Assistance Program. There's 3 levels of assistance, and it touches on the financial area and the technical area. There's an application process when these products come out through the Implementation Assistance Program. Basically, different agencies can, MPOs, states, et cetera, resource agencies can apply to get an award through the program. We've had 3 rounds of them to date, and the round 4 is coming up, and the tools Steve was talking about are going to be part of round 4. So there's 3 levels of support that can come out of that, and basically I won't go into the details of these, but they have different levels of financial assistance with them, and because the products are at different points. Like if we have a product where we're not really quite sure if it's ready, but we're hopeful about it, but we're not totally sure. We might do a proof of concept pilot to kind of get a few more users to try it so that we have a bigger experience base to then say, oh yes, we're confident this product should be used, widespread. We'd like to see it used widespread. Let's move it further forward. If we're kind of past that point, then we might do a lead adopter, where there hasn't been a lot of use yet, so we need some champions, and they'll need a little bit more financial support then to kind of incentivize that. And then the user incentive is usually when there's been some early adoption already, so it's a little lower level of financial assistance. So just to give you an idea, the number of the involvement, the participation in this program for SHRP2 implementation across all the focus areas, that gives you an idea. There were 6 products that were rolled out in the first round, and we had 34 states in the District of Columbia participate from that. And there's 108 projects that has involved implementing one or more of the products on. The second round, it was different products offered in different rounds. The second round, we had 18 states get some kind of award through the program in there. And there are four products that were rolled out there. And the first round was when the capability maturity model was part of that John spoke about this morning. And then for the upcoming rounds, or actually one that's getting evaluated now is round 3. Announcements awards for round 3 is anticipated late March, and we do have a joint capacity reliability effort there, and that's on freight demand modeling and data improvement. That was done in C20 project there. So those applications already have been submitted, and the application period closed, so we'll have awards for that soon. And then the round 4 is the one I mentioned coming up here in June that will have the tools that Steve was talking about. So there'll be an opportunity if your agency or an agency you work with might be interested in trying out one or more of those products. We don't know exactly what the assistance will look like yet. We're still going to be having a discussion next week to have a workshop to kind of help formulate what that should look like.